Look up at a high voltage power line tower, and you'll see these massive ridges holding up the heavy metal wires. Or look inside your mouse, right? And you might have a bright white dental crown.
Oh, yeah.
Walk through a world-class museum, and you'll find these priceless Ming Dynasty vases locked behind bulletproof glass. What ties all of those together? It's the exact same man-made high-temperature chemistry. Now, hold that thought for a second and just picture that glass-fronted cabinet in an older relative's dining room.
I know exactly the one you mean.
Right, the one filled with the quote-unquote fine china, those delicate, dusty teacups you were told never, ever to touch.
Yeah, it's the ultimate symbol of fragility, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we look at those teacups and see a relic of a bygone era, like something purely decorative and just inherently weak.
Right, but today, for you listening, our mission on this deep dive is to completely shatter that illusion. Because the truth about the material sitting in that grandmother's cabinet is, well, it's much darker and way more industrial than some polite afternoon tea.
Oh, absolutely.
This single material sparked global trade wars. It led to the state-sponsored imprisonment of alchemists, and quietly, without most of us even noticing, it literally built the modern electrical grid.
We are talking about a substance that for centuries was literally known as white gold. I mean, it was a fiercely guarded scientific marvel. Empires bled their treasuries dry trying to acquire it, and then they spent centuries desperately trying to steal the recipe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why entire nations lost their collective minds over what is, let's be honest, essentially dirt, we have to look at the chemistry.
Right.
We have to understand what this material actually is. And calling it just pottery feels like a massive understatement.
Oh, to call porcelain regular pottery is like calling a diamond just a rock.
Right.
Yes, both standard earthenware and porcelain are technically ceramics. But the divergence happens in the extreme conditions required to make it. You start with a very specific primary ingredient. It's a white clay mineral called kaolinite. But just having the clay isn't nearly enough. You have to subject it to an incredibly brutal environment, heating it in a kiln to temperatures between 1,200 and 1,400 degrees Celsius.
Which is well over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that is basically the temperature of flowing lava.
It is a crucible.
Mm-hmm.
And that extreme heat, it's completely non-negotiable because it triggers a profound transformation on a molecular level. At those temperatures, a process called vitrification occurs.
Vitrification, so it turns to glass.
Exactly. The intense heat essentially melts the silica present in the clay, and it turns into glass.
I have to pause you right there because that feels like a massive contradiction to me. Glass is famously brittle. Like, if I take a glass from my cupboard and pour boiling water into it, it shatters instantly.
Oh, for sure.
But historical porcelain is famous for surviving extreme temperature changes. So if this clay is turning into glass inside the kiln, why doesn't it just shatter the second it experiences a sudden shift in heat?
That is the perfect question, and it really gets to the heart of why this material is such a technological marvel. Vitrification is only half of the chemical reaction. While the silica is melting into glass, the extreme heat is simultaneously forcing the formation of a brand new mineral within the clay body itself. It's called mullite.
Mullite.
Yes, mullite forms these long needle-like crystals that interlock with one another. So if you picture a matrix of glass, but running all through that glass is a dense, rigid skeleton of crystalline needles.
Ah, okay, so it's acting like rebar inside a concrete pillar.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. The glass provides the impermeability, making it completely watertight, while the mullite skeleton provides this extraordinary mechanical strength and halts cracks from propagating.
Wow.
That is the secret architecture that gives porcelain its defining characteristics. The fact that it's completely impermeable, the brilliant whiteness, that ringing resonance you hear if you tap it.
Yeah, that classic sound.
Right. And the fact that you can hold a thin piece up to the light and actually see right through it.
But actually achieving that internal architecture sounds like a total nightmare for the person working the clay. I was looking at the historical records, and they talk about classifying clay into long and short categories. And long clays are highly plastic, right? They're sticky, cohesive, easy to stretch and mold on a wheel. But kaolin, the essential ingredient for porcelain, is a short clay.
Very short. The kaolinite particles are relatively large, and they don't easily slide past one another. They just don't absorb water in the same smooth, forgiving way that typical river clay does.
I was trying to picture what that actually feels like in your hands, and it instantly made me think of baking a really temperamental dough. You know, you're trying to mix it, and it feels like a crumbly, unworkable mess, so you add just like 3 extra drops of water and suddenly it collapses into soup.
Oh, it is notoriously unforgiving. If you stretch it too far, it tears. If it's too wet, it slumps. If the kiln temperature is off by a few degrees, the whole batch is ruined.
So if this material is an absolute nightmare to work with, what drove someone to keep failing at it until they figured it out? Like, why go through the agony of building fires that hot just to make a bowl?
What's fascinating here is the sheer magnitude of the payoff, especially when you consider the context of the ancient world. Like, put yourself in the shoes of someone living hundreds or thousands of years ago.
Okay.
Your options for dining wares are mostly wood, which absorbs rancid fats and tastes like yesterday's meal.
Gross.
Right. Or porous, low-fired earthenware, which holds odors and stains easily. Metals might rust or leach metallic flavors into your food.
And then someone hands you a bowl made of porcelain.
Exactly. It's perfectly white. It's completely odorless. It washes clean with just a splash of water even before you put a glaze on it because the material itself is impermeable. It is highly resistant to corrosive chemicals. And, as we discussed with the malite skeleton, it has massive resistance to thermal shock. You could pour boiling water into a freezing cold cup and it wouldn't break. To the ancient mind, this wasn't just a nice plate. It must have looked like alien technology.
And the culture that first successfully engineered that alien technology was China. But this wasn't some lucky overnight discovery, was it? We see a staggering timeline of trial and error. The Chinese were experimenting with what historians call proto-porcelain, all the way back in the Shang dynasty, somewhere around 1600 BCE.
Yeah, it took centuries of refining the clay mixtures and kiln designs, but by the Eastern Han dynasty, around the 1st or 2nd century CE, and certainly by the Tang dynasty, they had really mastered it.
They hit the sweet spot?
They did. They achieved those now standard requirements of pure whiteness and translucency.
And they didn't just keep this as a small artisanal hobby. They scaled it up to a level that honestly breaks my brain. By the time we get to the Song dynasty, around the 10th to 13th centuries, they had engineered these massive structures called dragon kilns.
The dragon kilns are an absolute masterclass in thermal engineering. They were essentially these long brick tunnels built up the sides of hills.
Up the hills?
Yeah, by building them on an incline, they created a massive natural draft, like a giant chimney, pulling the intense heat upward through the chamber to reach those elusive 1400-degree temperatures.
And the capacity of these kilns is the crazy part. Archaeological excavations show that a single dragon kiln could fire up to 100,000 pieces of porcelain at one time.
Let that number sink in for a moment. 100,000 pieces in a single firing.
That's industrial scale.
This is centuries before the Industrial Revolution in Europe.
Yeah.
The Chinese had created a highly organized, massive-scale manufacturing operation, effectively building a global monopoly on the most advanced material science of the age.
And that monopoly meant massive economic power. This porcelain began flowing outward. It traveled overland along the Silk Road into the Islamic world, where it was incredibly prized. And then, as we move into the Ming dynasty, which is famous for those iconic blue and white patterns you see in museums, the global dynamic shifts entirely. The oceans open up.
Portuguese merchants established direct sea trade in 1517, and the Dutch followed by 1598. This was a major turning point in global economics because suddenly massive shipments of porcelain were arriving in Europe.
And Europe just bled itself dry trying to buy it. They became completely addicted to this material. The obsession was so intense that in English-speaking countries, we literally named the material after the country it came from, right? Fine China.
Yeah, exactly.
But here is the core tension of this entire deep dive. The Europeans were mesmerized by it. They were spending immense fortunes to import it, but they had absolutely no idea how to actually make it.
They were looking at the finished product, but the underlying chemistry was a complete black box to them. Importing it was draining European treasuries, so there was an immense state-sponsored incentive to figure out the recipe.
Marco Polo had written about it in the 13th century, right?
He had. And by the 16th century, Portuguese traders had even managed to smuggle physical samples of raw kaolin back to Europe.
But having the flour doesn't mean you know how to bake the soufflé.
Precisely. European potters ran countless experiments, but the exact ratios and, crucially, the ability to achieve those extreme kiln temperatures completely eluded them. The results were unpredictable and mostly ended in spectacular failures.
Which leads us directly into one of the wildest historical tangents I've ever heard. This desperate European scramble sets the stage for the story of Johann Friedrich Böttger.
Ah, yes. A truly fascinating figure. He was trained as a pharmacist, but pivoted his career entirely into alchemy.
As you do.
Right, the logical next step.
So in the early 1700s, Butker starts boasting around town that he has discovered the ultimate alchemical secret. He claims he can transmute dross, basically worthless dirt, and lead into actual physical gold.
A bold claim.
Very. Well, word of this gets back to Augustus II, who happens to be the king of Poland and the elector of Saxony. And Augustus thinks, perfect, my treasury is completely empty from buying all this Chinese porcelain. I need gold. So the king literally has Butker arrested and thrown into a dungeon with orders to manufacture gold.
It is quite the high-stakes incentive program. Make the king the richest man in Europe or remain imprisoned indefinitely.
But here's where it gets really interesting. I'm trying to wrap my head around this pivot. How does a guy locked in a basement trying to magically conjure gold out of lead end up inventing the European recipe for teapots?
To understand that, you really have to realize that to the 18th century mind, the creation of porcelain essentially was alchemy.
Oh, interesting.
Taking muddy clay and transforming it into a ringing, translucent, brilliant white stone seemed just as magical as creating gold. And King Augustus eventually realized Butker wasn't going to produce actual gold. But Augustus was also heavily invested in the porcelain race. He employed a brilliant scientist named Ehrenfried Walther von Tschirnhaus.
Okay.
And Tschirnhaus had been trying to solve the porcelain problem for years using massive optical lenses to focus sunlight and test the melting points of different minerals.
So the king basically forces a collaboration.
He essentially reassigns Butker. He pairs the imprisoned alchemist with his top scientist. And the combination of Tschirnhaus's rigorous scientific methodology and Butker's practical experience with high-temperature alchemical furnaces was the key.
Wow.
Together, they started testing local Saxon clays.
And they finally hit the jackpot. In 1708, they successfully produced a hard, white, translucent ceramic. They used a specific local kaolin mixed with alabaster.
Tschirnhaus actually passed away later that same year, leaving Butker to present the final perfected formula to the king in 1709. This is why Butker often receives the lion's share of the historical credit.
Ah, I see.
But the culmination of this dungeon science was the birth of the legendary Meissen factory in 1710. And this was not some cheap imitation. This was true. High-fired porcelain hitting that brutal 1400-degree threshold.
And the durability of the Meissen porcelain became legendary almost immediately. There is an amazing historical account from a visitor to the factory during Butker's era. They reported watching workers pull a glowing, white-hot teapot straight out of the roaring kiln and plunge it directly into a bucket of freezing cold water.
Incredible.
And it didn't even crack.
The Mollite skeleton in action, the resistance to thermal shock was absolute.
So suddenly, Saxony possesses the most valuable industrial secret in Europe, and they clamped down on it like it was nuclear launch codes.
They certainly tried,
Yeah.
but an economic secret that valuable exerts way too much pressure on the people holding it.
Yeah, it couldn't be contained. Just 2 years after the Meissen factory opens, the entire global monopoly collapses thanks to a French Jesuit missionary named François-Xavier d'Entrecourt. In 1712, he was living in China, moving among the workers, observing the ancient Chinese manufacturing methods firsthand.
Right.
And he wrote these incredibly detailed letters back to Europe, outlining the exact ingredients, the processes, the kiln structures. Those letters were published, and the secret was out.
It was one of the most consequential acts of industrial espionage in early modern history.
And the fallout was massive. The industry explodes globally. But what I find so compelling is that not everyone who read those letters could replicate the process perfectly.
No, not at all.
This global race to manufacture white gold resulted in centuries of desperate state-sponsored counterfeiting, and it left us with 3 distinct flavors of porcelain.
Right. Synthesizing the historical development, we can categorize them into hard paste, soft paste, and bone china.
Hard paste is what we've been discussing, right?
Yeah.
The original Chinese method, the Japanese method, and the Meissen breakthrough. It requires true kaolin and those extreme 1400-degree temperatures.
Correct.
But the other 2 categories are where the counterfeiting comes in. What exactly was soft paste?
Soft paste was essentially the early European attempt to fake the result before they had the true chemistry. They lacked the right clay or the kilns capable of reaching the necessary heat, so they just improvised. They mixed various clays with frit, which is simply powdered glass.
That seems like a terrible idea structurally. I'm imagining like baking a cake, but instead of using flour and baking soda and relying on the chemical reaction to make it rise, you just look at a picture of a cake and try to sculpt it out of plaster and paint.
That's pretty close.
It might look right on the outside, but it's going to collapse the second you put it in an oven.
That is a highly accurate analogy for what happened inside the kilns. Because they were trying to force a glass-like state at much lower temperatures, the soft taste pieces suffered from massive structural failures. The technical term is pyroplastic deformation.
Pyroplastic deformation.
Yes. When the kilns heated up, the powdered glass would melt too quickly, and the teacups and bowls would simply slump and melt under their own weight.
Just turning into puddles. Even the ones that survived the firing process were weaker, right? They scratched easily, and if you poured really hot tea into a soft paste cup, the sudden heat could cause it to crack.
Exactly. It was a flawed workaround.
But there is a third category that emerged from this era of counterfeiting, and it is a distinctly English innovation: bone china.
In the mid-18th century, English potters were desperate to compete with the influx of hard-paste porcelain. A man named Josiah Spode is generally credited with perfecting the recipe that would define English ceramics. The recipe is startlingly literal. Roughly 1 part kaolin, 1 part china stone, and 2 parts actual bone ash.
Wait, literally the ash from animal bones mixed into the clay?
Literally animal bones, mostly cattle.
That sounds incredibly primitive to me, but it became a massive global industry. Why did bone ash actually work?
This is where the blind trial and error of the period is just so fascinating. The English potters didn't fully understand the molecular chemistry at the time, but bone ash is primarily composed of calcium phosphate. When introduced to the clay mixture, the calcium phosphate acts as a powerful flux.
The flux?
Yeah, it significantly lowers the temperature required for the material to vitrify.
Oh, so they didn't need the 1400-degree dragon kilns anymore.
Exactly. It lowered the firing temperature while simultaneously maintaining incredible mechanical strength and enhancing the bright, milky whiteness of the final product. It was a masterstroke of accidental chemistry that allowed England to absolutely dominate the market.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the tipping point. Once the chemistry for hard paste, soft paste, and bone china was industrialized across different nations, porcelain lost its status as this elusive, magical rarity. It became democratized.
And that transition is crucial. Once humanity secured a reliable, mass-producible material that was perfectly white, impervious to liquid, incredibly hard, and highly resistant to chemical corrosion, they stopped restricting it to royal dining rooms.
Right.
The applications moved rapidly into the industrial and the architectural.
I want to look at some of the wild non-teacup applications that emerged because the data is amazing. First up is sanitary ware. Because of its impermeability, by the late 17th century, wealthy Europeans started using glazed porcelain for personal hygiene, specifically these porcelain chamber pots called bordeleus.
When you consider the rudimentary hygiene standards and the prevalence of disease at the time, a vessel that completely resists absorbing bacteria or odors is a major public health advancement.
Definitely. But I do need to clear up a massive modern misconception here for you listening. If you walk into a bathroom today, you probably call your bathtub porcelain. That is actually a complete lie. Modern bathtubs are not made of porcelain clay. They are typically heavy cast iron or steel coated in vitreous enamel. Porcelain enamel is just a clever marketing phrase used to make metal tubs sound luxurious. Real sanitary porcelain is mostly restricted to modern toilets and wash basins, which are often referred to as vitreous china.
It speaks to the psychological power of the word porcelain, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Centuries later, marketers are still leveraging the association with cleanliness and wealth.
Absolutely. We also see it scale up into architecture. People built entire rooms out of interlocking porcelain tiles. There was the famous Porcelain Tower of Nanjing in China. But what amazed me was the modern architectural use.
Well, the durability of the material in extreme weather makes it an incredible exterior building material. Decades of wind, driving rain, and blistering sun won't degrade porcelain the way they strip paint or rot wood.
Yeah.
The Gulf Building in Houston, Texas, constructed in 1929, is a perfect example of this.
Yes, I saw that in the data. They literally put a 21-meter long, that's a 69-foot porcelain logo on the exterior of a skyscraper.
And it's completely impervious to the Texas weather.
And we even use it inside our own bodies. Dentistry relies on it. Because porcelain possesses such high compressive strength, and because you can precisely formulate the feldspar, quartz, and kaolin to mimic the exact translucency and whiteness of human enamel, it's the premium material for dental crowns and veneers.
This raises an important question, though. We've traced the journey from delicate teacups to chamber pots to skyscrapers to human teeth. But we haven't touched on what is arguably the single most critical application of this material in the modern era.
Oh, right.
The application that quietly underpins our entire technological society.
Electrical insulators. This completely blew my mind when I realized it.
Because porcelain is so remarkably stable in harsh environments, and because that interlocking mullite structure provides massive mechanical strength, it is the premier material for insulating high-voltage electrical transmission lines.
I was looking at the history of the electrical grid, and they've been using porcelain for this since at least the late 1800s, starting with early telegraph lines in Germany. So when you drive down the highway and look up at those towering metal pylons carrying hundreds of thousands of volts across the country, those ridged bell-shaped discs hanging off the wires, those are made of porcelain.
And you have to consider the physical demands placed on those insulators.
Mm,
People might wonder, why not just use cheap glass?
right,
Because glass can crack under physical tension and extreme temperature shifts.
right.
Those insulators have to hold up miles of incredibly heavy metal cable, endure freezing blizzards and blistering heat waves, all while preventing massive electrical currents from arch take into the metal towers and grounding out.
It's doing so much work.
The electrical grid as we know it, the system powering whatever device you are listening to right now, would simply not function without this ancient Chinese pottery technique.
Just to put a final cap on how far we have pushed the boundaries of this dirt, there is an ultimate marvel of modern manufacturing. In 2018, Guinness World Records certified a porcelain bushing insulator built for a high-voltage substation by a company called NGK in Japan as the world's largest ceramic structure.
Oh, the NGK bushing.
Yes, it stands 11.3 meters tall. That is over 37 feet of solid, unbroken porcelain.
It is a breathtaking feat of engineering. To maintain the exact chemical ratios and thermal controls required to successfully vitrify a 37-foot monolith without it cracking or slumping in the kiln is almost unimaginable.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a fragile, dusty teacup in a glass cabinet, but the reality is that the simple coffee mug you used this morning is actually a monument.
Absolutely.
It is a monument to 1400-degree chemistry. It is a monument to ancient dragon kilns that fired 100,000 pieces at a time, to an imprisoned alchemist in a Saxon dungeon, to a Jesuit spy stealing state secrets, and to centuries of global industrial espionage.
It is a perfect distillation of human ingenuity and our relentless drive to master the materials around us. But it also leaves me with a somewhat provocative thought for you to ponder.
Okay, let's hear it.
Typically, we define ancient civilizations by the beautiful, delicate pottery they left behind. We carefully excavate their urns and bowls and put them on pedestals in museums to understand who they were.
Right.
But considering the incredible durability of this material, thousands of years from now, future archaeologists might dig up the ruins of our civilization. And they might judge us not by our fine art, but by our perfectly preserved spark plugs, our massive high-voltage grid insulators, and millions of unyielding dental veneers. What will that say about who we were?
Wow. That is a wild image to end on. A future museum display featuring a 37-foot electrical insulator next to a perfect set of bright white porcelain teeth. So the next time you visit an older relative and you see that delicate fine china sitting in the cabinet, hopefully, you will look at it with a profound new sense of wonder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.